There is something strange about Charles Darwin. Almost everyone knows his name, almost everyone knows his theory, and almost everyone learns the same simple version of it. Animals are born slightly different from one another. Some differences help them survive. Those animals reproduce more. Their traits spread. Give it enough generations, and life changes. Natural selection, survival of the fittest, evolution. Darwin figured it out. Except he didn't. Darwin had no idea what DNA was. He didn't know what a gene was. He didn't understand mutations. He had never seen a chromosome carrying hereditary information. And perhaps most importantly, he couldn't properly explain how a useful trait actually passed from a parent to its child. That is a fairly serious problem when your entire theory depends on useful traits being inherited. And it gets worse, because after Darwin died, scientists kept discovering things that seemed to make his neat picture of evolution messier and messier. Chance could change populations without favoring the strongest. Genes could move between organisms that weren't even parent and child. A tiny change in developmental instructions could reorganize an entire animal. Humans could create environments that then changed the pressures acting on human genes. And inheritance itself turned out to be stranger than simply copying a sequence of DNA. So, how much of Darwin is actually left? Was the theory of evolution slowly disproved, piece by piece? Not exactly. Something much more interesting happened. Darwin's theory survived. But it survived by doing the very thing Darwin said life had always done. It changed. In 1859, Darwin published On the Origin of Species, and at the center of the book was an idea that was both revolutionary and strangely simple. More organisms are born than can survive. Individuals are not identical. Some differences affect survival and reproduction. If those differences can be inherited, then generation after generation, nature can gradually reshape a population. No creature has to know where it is going. There is no blueprint, no finish line, no hand carefully redesigning each species. Just variation, inheritance, and time. Darwin could look at birds with different beaks, orchids with bizarre shapes, or the strange animals of distant islands and imagine a process capable of producing all of them. But hidden inside that beautiful idea was one word doing an enormous amount of work: inheritance. Suppose a bird is born with a beak that gives it an advantage. It survives, it reproduces. Great. But if its chicks don't inherit that useful variation, then natural selection has nothing to preserve. Evolution needs memory, and Darwin did not know where that memory was stored. He tried. Darwin eventually proposed an idea called pangenesis, imagining tiny hereditary particles produced throughout the body and somehow gathered into the reproductive system. It was an attempt to solve the missing piece. It was also wrong. And while one of the most famous scientists in Britain was struggling with inheritance, a monk in Central Europe was spending years doing something that looked much less impressive. He was counting peas. Gregor Mendel grew thousands of pea plants in the garden of a monastery. Tall plants, short plants, yellow seeds, green seeds, smooth, wrinkled. Again and again, he crossed plants with different traits and watched what appeared in their descendants. And something strange happened. The traits did not simply dissolve into one another like two colors of paint. They behaved more like separate pieces of information. A trait might disappear in one generation, then return in the next. Mendel did not know about DNA either. He did not know the molecular structure of a gene, but he had found mathematical patterns in inheritance. He had found part of Darwin's missing memory. The strange part is that Mendel published his results in 1866, and for decades, almost nobody realized how important they were. His work sat quietly while evolutionary biology moved on without it. Then, around the beginning of the 20th century, Mendel's ideas were rediscovered. And biology suddenly had a problem. Genetics and Darwinism didn't immediately fit together as neatly as we might imagine today. Darwin had emphasized gradual variation. Early geneticists often studied traits that looked sharply separated. For a time, some scientists wondered whether Mendelian genetics might actually weaken Darwin's theory. Instead, the two ideas were eventually welded together. Genes could preserve variation. Mutation could create new variation. Recombination could reshuffle it. and natural selection could change how common different variants became across a population. By the middle of the 20th century, this became part of what we now call the modern synthesis. Darwin's central idea survived, but Darwin's explanation of inheritance did not. One piece died, another took its place, and the theory became stronger because of it. That could have been the end of the story. It wasn't. Because eventually, scientists discovered that even having the better gene did not guarantee that evolution would choose you. In 1775, a devastating typhoon struck the tiny Pacific atoll of Pingelap. The population collapsed. Only a small number of people survived. Over time, the island was repopulated by the descendants of those survivors. But hidden among the genes of that tiny surviving population was a rare variant associated with achromatopsia, a condition that severely affects color vision and visual acuity. Because the new population descended from so few people, that rare variant became unusually common. Today, Pingelap is famous for the unusually high prevalence of the condition. Now think about what happened. The typhoon did not inspect anyone's genes. It didn't compare two people and decide which one was more evolutionarily advanced. It didn't reward the strongest. It didn't punish the weakest. It was a storm. People died. Some survived. And whatever genes happened to exist among the survivors became disproportionately important to the generations that followed. That is the uncomfortable role of chance in evolution. Population geneticists call processes like this genetic drift. Alleles can become more common or disappear simply because populations are finite, and history is messy. Then, in 1968, Japanese geneticist Motoo Kimura pushed the role of chance even further. Kimura looked at the rate of molecular change and argued that many substitutions at the molecular level were not being driven by advantageous natural selection at all. They were neutral, or close enough to neutral that random drift could determine their fate. His neutral theory became one of the great evolutionary debates of the 20th century. Natural selection had not disappeared, but it had lost something: its monopoly. Not every surviving genetic change represented a brilliant adaptation. Not every winner had won because it was better. Sometimes, nobody wins. Something just doesn't disappear. Then evolution produced a different kind of problem, a very small one: a fruit fly. Edward Lewis spent decades studying mutations in Drosophila, and some of those mutations did something extraordinary. Instead of merely changing the size of a wing or the color of an eye, they changed what an entire part of the animal became. In one famous form, a fly could develop what looked like a second pair of wings, 4 wings instead of 2. Think about how strange that is. This isn't like changing the paint on a house. It's closer to changing the instruction that tells the builders, this room should be a kitchen, and suddenly, they build another bedroom instead. The discovery helped reveal something fundamental. Genes don't only specify ingredients. Some genes help control the developmental programs that tell a growing organism where structures belong and what those structures should become. Lewis's work on these developmental control systems eventually helped earn him a share of the 1995 Nobel Prize. And that changed the evolutionary question. It was no longer enough to ask, which variation will natural selection favor? You also had to ask, which variations can development actually produce? Natural selection cannot choose from an infinite collection of imaginable animals. It can only act on variation that biology is capable of generating. Natural selection doesn't order from an infinite menu. Development writes the menu first, and evolution has to choose from what is already there. That is why organisms often look less like perfect machines and more like ancient buildings that have been renovated for millions of years. Old structures get reused. Old pathways acquire new jobs. New rooms are built on top of older ones. Nothing begins from a blank page. Evolution is not an engineer with unlimited freedom. It is a repairman who is never allowed to turn the building off. Darwin famously imagined the history of life as a tree. One lineage splits into 2. Then 2 become 4. Branches spread outward. Some end, others continue. For much of life, that is still an incredibly useful picture. But microorganisms have a habit of ruining clean diagrams. Because bacteria can do something a family tree is not supposed to do, they can exchange genes sideways. Not from parent to offspring, from one organism to another. Horizontal gene transfer allows genetic material to move across lineages, and mechanisms such as plasmid exchange can help traits like antibiotic resistance spread through bacterial populations. Try drawing that. One branch becomes two. Then one branch sends a gene into another branch. Then another does the same. Then several branches reconnect. Very quickly, your beautiful tree starts looking less like a tree and more like a network. Or, if Darwin had Wi-Fi, the internet. The tree of life wasn't suddenly useless, but once again, the clean version was too clean. Reality had added another line to the drawing. For most mammals, drinking milk is a childhood activity. A baby is born, it produces the enzyme lactase, it drinks milk. Then, after weaning, lactase production normally falls. For most of mammalian history, this made perfect sense. Adults don't usually walk around drinking the milk of another species. Then humans did exactly that. We domesticated animals, we milked them, and we kept drinking. At first, this was not a genetic mutation creating a new behavior. It was culture, a human invention, a new way of living. But once dairying existed, the environment humans lived in had changed, and in several human populations, genetic variants allowing lactase production to continue into adulthood rose to high frequencies under strong selection. This is where evolution begins to loop back on itself. Humans changed their behavior. The behavior changed their environment. The new environment changed which genes could become advantageous. Culture helps change natural selection. This is gene-culture coevolution, and lactase persistence became one of its most famous examples. But even this story became less tidy when scientists looked more closely. For years, the obvious explanation sounded simple. People began drinking milk. People who could digest milk had more surviving children. The lactase persistence variant spread. Done. But archaeological and genetic evidence suggest milk use was already widespread in parts of Europe long before lactase persistence alleles reached today's high frequencies. A large study published in 2022 argued that simple levels of milk consumption do not fully explain the genetic trajectory. The authors proposed that famine and exposure to pathogens may have made the consequences of consuming milk without lactase persistence much more dangerous in particular historical conditions. So even one of our cleanest examples of natural selection became complicated again. Maybe that is the pattern. Every time evolution starts looking simple, someone collects more data. And now, we arrive at the part of the story where the internet usually loses its mind. Epigenetics. DNA sequence matters enormously. But genes are not simply switches that are either permanently on or permanently off. Cells regulate which genes are active. Chemical modifications, including DNA methylation, can influence gene activity without changing the underlying DNA letters themselves. And environmental conditions can influence some of those regulatory patterns. One of the most famous demonstrations involves mice carrying a particular version of the agouti gene. Researchers found that altering the diet of pregnant mice with nutrients involved in methyl group metabolism could change methylation at a regulatory region in their offspring. The DNA sequence of those offspring had not been rewritten. Yet the difference in regulation could be visible with your own eyes, because it was associated with dramatic differences in coat color: yellow, mottled, brown. Similar underlying genetics, different epigenetic states. And this is usually the exact moment someone on the internet announces, "Darwin was wrong, Lamarck was right." No. Sorry, the giraffe guy does not get his victory lap that easily. Epigenetic effects are real. Some epigenetic states can persist through cell divisions, and there are genuine cases in which epigenetic information can cross generations. But that does not mean every trait acquired during life becomes heritable. And it does not mean environmental experience can freely rewrite organisms and hand those improvements to their descendants. Even the famous agouti system turned out to be more subtle than the headline. Researchers specifically tested whether diet-induced methylation at that locus accumulated as a simple transgenerational inheritance through the female line. It did not. So epigenetics gave us a perfect miniature version of the entire story. First, the textbook picture was too simple. Then, the correction became too simple. Reality sat somewhere in the annoying middle, which may be one of the most important rules in science. Whenever someone says, everything we knew was wrong, they are usually about to make the story easier than reality actually is. Now we can finally return to the question we started with. Was Darwin wrong? Yes, about some things. His own proposed mechanism of inheritance did not survive. He couldn't know about genes or DNA. He couldn't know about molecular neutral evolution. He couldn't know about horizontal gene transfer as we understand it today. He couldn't know about modern developmental genetics. He couldn't know what genomes would reveal. He couldn't know about epigenetic regulation in its modern molecular form. If Charles Darwin walked into a genetics laboratory today, he would probably recognize almost none of the equipment. Most of the terminology would be foreign. Much of the mathematics would be new. The amount of biological information available to a student with a laptop would have been unimaginable to him. And yet, if someone explained what all of it meant, something would still feel familiar. Populations change. Heritable variation matters. Species share ancestry. Natural selection shapes adaptation. Those ideas did not vanish. They became pieces inside a much larger machine. And this is where I think people misunderstand what it means for a scientific theory to survive. A theory does not become strong because nobody ever finds a problem with it. Quite the opposite. A strong scientific idea spends its entire life being attacked. Scientists look for cases it cannot explain. They design experiments that could prove parts of it wrong. They find exceptions. They argue. They replace mechanisms. They redraw diagrams. And if reality demands it, they throw pieces away. Darwin's pangenesis disappeared. Evolution survived. Genetics changed the theory. Evolution survived. Drift reduced the role we once gave to selection. Evolution survived. The tree of life became tangled. Evolution survived. Development complicated variation. Evolution survived. Culture altered human selection pressures. Evolution survived. Epigenetics complicated inheritance. Evolution survived. Not because Darwin got everything right, but because science allowed parts of Darwin to be wrong. There is something almost poetic about that. Darwin spent his life arguing against the idea that survival requires remaining unchanged. Life survives precisely because it doesn't remain unchanged. Environments shift. Populations vary. Some forms disappear. Others continue. Generation after generation, the living world becomes something it wasn't before. And strangely, that is almost exactly what happened to Darwin's theory. It began in 1859 without genes, without DNA, without modern population genetics, without molecular biology, without evo-devo, without genomics. It was incomplete. And then scientists began changing it. They didn't preserve Darwin by freezing his ideas in the 19th century. They preserved what survived the evidence and replaced what didn't. That difference matters because belief often treats change as a threat. If an idea must be corrected, we assume it has become weaker. But science can work in the opposite direction. A theory can become stronger because something inside it was allowed to die. Newton was not erased by Einstein. Darwin was not erased by genetics. Knowledge rarely moves forward by burning every old book and beginning again. More often, it keeps what still works, changes what doesn't, and becomes something its creator could never have predicted. Darwin did not give us the final theory of evolution. He gave us the beginning of one. Almost 2 centuries later, we are still changing it, still arguing about it, still discovering mechanisms he never saw, still finding places where the simple story fails, still cutting away explanations that cannot survive contact with reality. And perhaps the strangest thing is, Darwin should have understood that better than almost anyone. Because his greatest idea was never that the strongest survives. It was never that life moves toward perfection. It was that over enough time, things capable of changing can become things their ancestors never were. His own theory did exactly that. It is still here, not untouched, Not finished, not entirely Darwin's anymore, but alive. Because in the end, the theory of evolution survived the same way life does. It evolved.